In 1867, a man with no engineering degree stood before the wealthiest businessmen in St. Louis and told them he could do what every qualified engineer in America said was impossible. He told them he could bridge the Mississippi River. Not with wood, not with iron, with steel. A material so new that no major structure in the world had ever been built with it. The river at St. Louis ran half a mile wide. The bedrock sat buried more than 100 feet beneath the riverbed. The current could rip a steamboat apart, and the federal government demanded that whatever bridge went up had to be tall enough for the largest vessels to pass beneath, and wide enough that no piers could obstruct the main channel. Every engineer who studied the problem came to the same conclusion. It could not be done. James Buchanan Eads listened to all of them, and then he built it anyway. 7 years later, on July 4th, 1874, 14 locomotives crossed that bridge at once, and the spans held. The crowds that gathered along the riverbanks watched the impossible become permanent. That bridge still stands today. You can walk across it right now, 150 years later, and feel the same steel under your feet that those locomotives tested. But here is what the celebration obscured. Here is what the ribbon-cutting ceremony did not mention. Here is what the newspapers chose not to dwell upon. To build that bridge, men had to descend into pressurized chambers sunk below the riverbed and dig through sand and clay in conditions no human being had ever endured before. They worked in air pressure so intense that their bodies absorbed nitrogen like sponges. And when they came back up too quickly, that nitrogen turned to bubbles in their blood. 15 men died. Dozens more were paralyzed. Some of them collapsed on the riverbank with their legs twisted beneath them, screaming in agony, their spines destroyed by a disease that doctors did not yet understand. Some made it home to their families before the pain began. Their wives watched helplessly as these strong men who had gone to work that morning came back broken, unable to stand, unable to explain what was happening to their own bodies. James Eads himself nearly died twice during construction. He pushed his body so hard that he had to direct operations from a wheelchair, issuing orders from his sickbed because he refused to stop. The bridge that would make him famous was also the bridge that nearly killed him. This is the story of how one man's obsession, one city's ambition, and the bodies of working men combined to accomplish what no one believed was possible. This is the story of the Eads Bridge, and it begins not on the Mississippi River, but beneath it. James Buchanan Eads was born in 1820 in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, and nothing about his early life suggested that he would become one of the greatest engineers America ever produced. His family was poor. His father failed at business repeatedly, dragging the family from town to town, chasing opportunities that never materialized. Young James received almost no formal education. What schooling he managed to get was sporadic, interrupted by each new family relocation. By the time he was 13, the family had moved to St. Louis, and James was working on the riverfront, selling apples to passengers on steamboats. He walked those wharves watching the great boats come and go. He saw cargo loaded and unloaded. He watched the river itself, learning its rhythms, its deceptions, its power. Most boys would have seen the Mississippi as simply water. James Eads saw it as a system. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. But here is what James Eads had that no engineering school could teach him. He had the Mississippi River as his classroom. He had poverty as his motivation. And he had a mind that could look at a problem everyone else had abandoned and see a solution nobody else had imagined. He spent his teenage years working on those steamboats, taking whatever jobs were available: deckhand, cabin boy, purser's assistant. He watched the engineers and pilots, studied how the boats worked, asked questions until the crew grew tired of answering them. Every job was an education. Every task taught him something about the river, about machinery, about the business of moving goods and people across water. By the time he was 22, Eads had invented something that would make him rich and teach him everything he needed to know about building beneath the water's surface. He built a diving bell. Picture this. The year is 1842. Steamboat traffic on the Mississippi has exploded. Hundreds of boats move up and down the river, carrying cotton, grain, passengers, and everything else that makes the American economy function. And those boats sink constantly. Snags tear open their hulls. Sandbars run them aground until their keels snapped. Boiler explosions killed passengers and crew and sent the wreckage spiraling to the bottom. Collisions in fog or darkness sent boats down in minutes. The bottom of the Mississippi was littered with wrecked vessels and their cargo. Most people saw disaster. James Eads saw opportunity. He designed a boat with a diving bell suspended beneath it, a bell large enough for a man to stand inside, sealed at the top with air pumped in from above. That man would be lowered to the riverbed, step out of the bell into the murky water, walk along the bottom, attach chains to sunken cargo, and signal to be hauled back up. The concept was not entirely new. Diving bells had existed for centuries, but nobody had tried to use one commercially on the Mississippi River, where the current was relentless, the visibility was zero, and the riverbed shifted constantly. Eads tried it anyway. For 8 years, James Eads personally descended to the bottom of the Mississippi River. Not once, not a dozen times, hundreds of times. He walked on that riverbed in total darkness, feeling his way through currents that pushed against his body like invisible hands. The water was cold. The pressure was crushing. The darkness was absolute. Try to imagine it. You are standing on the bottom of the Mississippi River. You cannot see your own hand in front of your face. The current is trying to knock you off your feet. Above you is 50, 60, 70 feet of water and sediment, and beneath your boots is a surface that might be sand, might be clay, might be the deck of a sunken steamboat, or the scattered remains of its cargo. You feel your way forward. You find a barrel of flour, or a bale of cotton, or a strongbox full of someone's savings. You attach a chain. You signal to be hauled up, and then you do it again. Eads learned things in those descents that no engineer sitting at a desk could have learned. He discovered that the riverbed was not simply mud, but layers. Clay beneath sand, beneath gravel, beneath more clay. He learned that these layers shifted constantly, that the river was always depositing in some places and scouring in others. He mapped the bottom with his hands and his feet, building a mental model of what lay beneath the surface. No engineer alive understood the Mississippi's riverbed the way James Eads understood it, because no engineer alive had walked on it. No engineer alive had felt the current pushing against his chest while he groped in the darkness for sunken treasure. That knowledge would prove invaluable when the time came to sink foundations for his bridge. By the time he was 30, Eads had made himself wealthy from salvage. He had contracts throughout the river system. His boats recovered cargo from wrecks that other salvagers had given up on. He became known as the man who could find anything the river had swallowed. But the work had destroyed his health. The repeated descents, the pressure changes, the cold and the darkness had wrecked his body. His lungs struggled. His joints ached constantly. His doctors told him to stop. They warned him that if he continued, the river would kill him just as surely as if he had drowned. He ignored them and kept diving until his body simply refused to cooperate anymore. Only when his lungs failed completely did he finally surface for the last time. He was 30 years old, wealthy beyond anything his father had ever achieved, and his doctors were not sure he would see 40. Then the Civil War came, and James Eads got a second chance to prove what he could build. In 1861, the Union desperately needed gunboats to control the western rivers. The Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri, the Cumberland, the Tennessee. Whoever controlled those waterways controlled the interior of the continent. Without river power, Union armies could not move men and supplies. Without river power, Confederate strongholds would remain unassailable. The traditional naval shipyards on the coasts could not help. Those yards were too far away, and the boats they built were designed for ocean warfare, not river combat. The Union needed something new. Shallow draft vessels that could navigate the river's shifting channels. Armored vessels that could withstand Confederate artillery. Vessels that did not yet exist. The government put out a call for proposals. James Eads submitted his. He promised to build 7 ironclad gunboats in 65 days. The proposal was insane. No shipyard in America had ever built armored vessels before. The specifications Eads proposed required innovations in metalworking, in propulsion, in hull design. The timeline was impossible. Experienced shipbuilders told the government that such boats could not be built in 6 months, let alone 65 days. The government accepted Eads's proposal anyway, because they had no other choice. Eads threw everything he had into the project. He bought 4 existing shipyards along the Mississippi and the Ohio and converted them all to gunboat production. He hired 4,000 workers. He secured contracts for iron plate, for engines, for lumber, for every material the boats would require. He worked 20-hour days, traveling between sites, solving problems that his foreman brought him, making decisions that would have taken weeks in a normal bureaucracy. He missed his deadline by just 2 weeks. 65 days became 77. But he produced the boats. The USS St. Louis, the USS Carondelet, the USS Pittsburgh, the USS Louisville, the USS Mound City, the USS Cairo, the USS Cincinnati. 7 ironclad gunboats that would change the course of the war in the West. Those ironclads fought at Fort Henry in February 1862, where the combined naval and ground assault forced the Confederates to surrender. They fought at Fort Donelson a week later, where Ulysses Grant demanded unconditional surrender and got it. They opened the rivers that had been closed to Union commerce. They proved that industrial capacity could translate directly into military power. One of them, the USS Cairo, now sits restored in Vicksburg, Mississippi, a testament to what Eads could accomplish when everyone told him the schedule was impossible. You can walk through that boat today and touch the iron plates that stopped Confederate shells. You can stand in the pilot house where men steered through enemy fire. You can feel the weight of what James Eads created in 77 days. But here is what mattered most about those gunboats. They taught James Eads how to manage massive construction projects. They taught him how to coordinate thousands of workers across multiple sites. They taught him how to procure materials during shortages, how to improvise when plans failed, how to make decisions quickly and live with the consequences. They taught him that the word impossible was usually spoken by people who had not tried hard enough. The man who emerged from the war was no longer simply a successful salvager with failing health. He was now a proven builder, a coordinator of industrial projects, a person who had delivered when the nation's survival was at stake. When the war ended, Eads turned his attention to the problem that had haunted St. Louis for decades. The city needed a bridge. You have to understand what St. Louis was in the 1860s to appreciate why this bridge mattered so much. St. Louis sat at the confluence of commerce. The Missouri River flowed in from the west, carrying furs and trade goods from the Rocky Mountains. The Mississippi flowed down from the north, carrying lumber and grain from Minnesota and Wisconsin, and continued south to New Orleans, carrying cotton and sugar and everything the South produced. Before the railroads came, St. Louis was the gateway to everything west of the river. If you wanted to reach California, you started in St. Louis. If you wanted to trade with Santa Fe, you started in St. Louis. If you wanted to ship anything, anywhere in the American interior, St. Louis was where the deals were made. But the railroads were coming. They were already there. And the railroads presented St. Louis with an existential crisis. Chicago had no river to cross. The railroads could run straight into Chicago from every direction. goods could load and unload without interruption. A manufacturer in Pittsburgh could ship to a buyer in Omaha without any break in the rail line. But at St. Louis, every railroad line from the east hit the Mississippi and stopped. Cargo had to be loaded onto ferries, shipped across the river, and loaded onto different trains on the western side. In winter, when the river froze, commerce stopped entirely. Ice locked the ferries in place. Goods piled up on the eastern bank, waiting for spring. Meanwhile, Chicago's trains kept running. Street. Lewis watched Chicago grow fat while it starved. The city fathers understood with increasing desperation that without a bridge, their city would wither. Chicago would become the capital of the American interior. St. Louis would become a backwater, a relic of the steamboat era, bypassed by the railroad age. The problem was the river itself. Stand on the St. Louis riverfront today and look at the Mississippi. It does not look bridgeable. At that point, the river runs roughly half a mile wide. The current flows fast enough to push debris at dangerous speeds. Entire trees come down that river during flood season, battering rams hurled by the current at anything that stands in their way. The water level fluctuates by 40 feet between flood and drought. A structure that stood clear of the water in August might be underwater in April. And underneath all that water, the situation gets worse. Engineers had surveyed the riverbed and discovered that solid rock lay buried more than 100 feet below the surface. That meant that any bridge pier would need foundations reaching down through 100 feet of sand, clay, and gravel before hitting something stable enough to support the structure. No bridge in America had foundations that deep. No bridge in the world had foundations that deep in a river with such powerful currents. The deepest foundations anyone had ever sunk in similar conditions reached perhaps 50 feet. What St. Louis needed was twice that depth. The federal government complicated matters further. They demanded that any bridge have a main span of at least 500 feet to allow steamboat traffic to pass. They demanded that the bridge deck sit at least 50 feet above the high water mark. These requirements were not suggestions. They were law, enforced by the Army Corps of Engineers, which controlled navigation on the nation's rivers. Every engineer who studied the problem produced the same report. The bridge could not be built. The spans were too long, the foundations too deep. The materials did not exist that could accomplish what St. Louis needed. Then James Eads presented his proposal. He would build 3 spans, 2 of them 502 feet long, the center span 520 feet. He would support those spans on 4 piers, 2 of them rising from the riverbed itself. He would sink foundations down through the sand and clay until they hit bedrock, using pneumatic caissons, a technology that had been tried in Europe, but never at this depth, never in these conditions, never in a river that fought back like the Mississippi. And he would build the entire structure not from iron, but from steel. The bridge companies that had been competing for the contract protested. Steel was experimental. It was expensive. It was untested in major construction. No one had ever built a bridge from steel. Using it was reckless, they said. It was irresponsible. It was the proposal of a man who did not understand the constraints of real engineering. Eads responded by pointing out that iron was not strong enough. The spans required by federal law could not be built from iron. The physics simply did not work. Iron lacked the tensile strength necessary to cross those distances without intermediate support. Only steel possessed the strength-to-weight ratio that would allow those spans to stand. He was right. The competitors knew he was right. They hated him for being right. The city of St. Louis awarded James Eads the contract in 1867. He immediately faced problems that would have broken a lesser man. First, there was the matter of the steel itself. American steel production was in its infancy. The Bessemer process had only been perfected a few years earlier, and most steel mills were still learning how to produce consistent quality. There were no established suppliers who could provide the volume and specifications that Eads needed. He solved this by writing his own specifications and enforcing them ruthlessly. Every batch of steel had to meet strength requirements that no manufacturer had achieved before. Eads tested every delivery personally. He built testing machines that could measure the exact tensile strength of each sample. He rejected batch after batch until the mills learned to produce what he demanded. Some estimates suggest that he rejected more than half of all the steel delivered to the construction site. The manufacturers complained bitterly. They called his standards unreasonable. They said he was costing them money with his obsessive testing. Eads did not care. He understood that if even one span failed, if even one member gave way under load, the bridge would collapse and kill everyone on it. His reputation could survive being called difficult. It could not survive being called the man whose bridge fell into the river. Second, there was the matter of sinking foundations to bedrock. This was the problem that had defeated every other proposal. This was the problem that made engineers call the bridge impossible. This was the problem that Eads attacked with pneumatic caissons. A pneumatic caisson is essentially an enormous box, open at the bottom, sealed at the top. You sink it to the riverbed and pump compressed air into it. The air pressure keeps the water out, creating a dry chamber on the riverbed where men can work. As the workers dig out sand and clay from inside the caisson sinks lower under its own weight. You keep digging, and the caisson keeps sinking until you hit bedrock. Then you fill the caisson with concrete and masonry and build your pier on top. The concept was simple. The execution was nightmarish. The east abutment caisson went down first, beginning in October 1869. This was the shallowest of the foundations, requiring a descent of only about 40 feet to bedrock. The work proceeded slowly but successfully. The men learned the rhythms of the caissons. They learned how to function in the compressed air. They learned that the strange atmosphere changed everything, made candles burn brighter, made voices sound higher, made breathing feel thick and labored. Then they began sinking the caissons for the river piers. And men started dying. Imagine descending into one of those caissons. You enter through an airlock at the top of the pier structure, climbing down through a narrow iron shaft. The shaft is dark and close. Water seeps through the joints. The air smells of rust and river mud. As you descend, the air pressure increases. Your ears pop and keep popping. Pain builds behind your eyes. By the time you reach the working chamber, the air pressure is 2 to 3 times normal atmospheric pressure. Every breath feels like drinking instead of breathing. The chamber itself is perhaps 10 feet high, lit by candles or oil lamps that burn with strange intensity in the dense air. The walls are iron. The floor is mud and sand and clay, constantly wet despite the air pressure. Men are swinging picks, filling buckets, hauling debris to shafts where it can be lifted out. The sound of metal on stone echoes in the confined space. Water drips from the walls. The temperature is over 100 degrees. The humidity is absolute. Sweat does not evaporate because the air is already saturated. You are breathing air so thick it feels like syrup in your lungs. Every motion requires extra effort. Your voice sounds strange, higher pitched in the pressurized atmosphere. And you work like this for hours. The first deaths were not immediate. That was what made them so terrifying. A worker would complete his shift in the caisson, ascend through the airlock, walk out into the fresh air, and feel fine. He would make it to the timekeeper's shed and collect his pay. He would start walking home, perhaps stopping to buy bread for dinner. And then he would collapse. Sometimes they would make it home first. Their wives would find them on the floor, unable to move their legs, screaming that their joints were on fire. Their spines felt like someone had driven nails through them. Their knees and elbows swelled and twisted. Some of them bent double from the pain, which is why the workers began calling it the bends. The doctors called it caisson disease. Nobody understood what was causing it. We know now. When you breathe air under pressure, your blood absorbs extra nitrogen. The higher the pressure, the more nitrogen dissolves into your bloodstream and your tissues. If you decompress slowly, the nitrogen releases gradually, passing out through your lungs as you exhale. Your body can handle this. But if you ascend quickly, if you go from high pressure to normal pressure in just a few minutes, that nitrogen comes out of solution all at once. It forms bubbles in your blood. Tiny bubbles at first, then larger ones. Bubbles that can lodge anywhere. In your joints, causing agonizing pain that feels like crushed glass inside your bones. In your spinal cord, killing nerve tissue, causing paralysis that may never heal. In your brain, causing stroke, causing seizures, causing death. The workers in Eads's caissons were ascending too quickly. They were coming up through the airlock in 5 or 10 minutes when they should have taken an hour or more. Nobody knew. Nobody had ever worked at these depths before. The European engineers who had pioneered caisson work had operated at shallower depths where the problem was less severe. Their workers had gotten sick, yes, but not like this, not dying in the streets hours after their shift ended. Eads hired a physician named Alphonse Jaminet to study the disease and treat the workers. Dr. Jaminet worked tirelessly, documenting symptoms, tracking who got sick and when, trying to find patterns. He noticed that workers who spent more time in the caissons got sicker. He noticed that workers who came up slowly seemed to fare better than those who rushed through the airlock. He recommended longer decompression times. He recommended shorter shifts. He was groping toward the truth, but without modern understanding of gas physics, he could not find the complete answer. Dr. Jaminet himself suffered a severe case of the bends after spending time in the caissons observing the work conditions. He lost consciousness on his way home and nearly died. When he recovered, he continued his research, now with personal knowledge of what the disease felt like. He described the sensation as if all his joints had been crushed and set on fire simultaneously. The numbers are stark. During the construction of the East Pier Foundation, which went down about 86 feet, 12 workers died from caisson disease. Many more were permanently disabled. Some of them were paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of their lives. Some suffered chronic pain that never faded. Some died months later from complications. And the work continued. This is the part of the story that we must not flinch from. This is the moral weight that comes with celebrating the achievement. The bridge did not build itself. It was built by men who knew they might die. Men who went down into those caissons anyway because they needed the wages. $3 a day. That was the standard pay for caisson work. $3 a day to descend into conditions that could kill you or cripple you for life. Most of the workers were immigrants. Irish fleeing the famine's long shadow. Germans fleeing political upheaval. Some were black freedmen who had come north looking for opportunities that the South would not provide. They had few choices. The caisson work paid better than most available labor. It paid better because no one wanted to do it. They took the risk, and when they came up broken, there was no workers' compensation. There was no disability insurance. There was no government program to help men who had been crippled building the nation's infrastructure. There was the company doctor who would try to help. And then there was the door. If you could no longer work, you were no longer employed. You went home to your family with destroyed legs and destroyed prospects, and $3 for your last shift. The West Pier Foundation went even deeper, over 90 feet to bedrock. At that depth, the air pressure in the working chambers reached levels that pushed the human body toward its absolute limits. Workers could only tolerate shifts of 2 hours before the accumulated nitrogen became too dangerous. 3 more men died during the West Pier excavation. Others were paralyzed. Some quit rather than go back down. The fear was constant. Every man who descended knew that he might not walk out under his own power. Every man who ascended spent the next few hours wondering if this would be the time the disease took him. The total toll, when the foundations were finally complete, stood at 15 dead and dozens permanently injured. And those are just the deaths directly attributed to caisson disease. Construction accidents killed others. Falls, crushing injuries, the ordinary hazards of building something enormous on a dangerous site. James Eads himself descended into the caissons multiple times. He wanted to see the conditions firsthand. He wanted to understand what his men were enduring. He wanted the workers to know that he was not asking them to go somewhere he would not go himself. And the pressure wrecked his body just as it wrecked theirs. Eads had never fully recovered from his salvage diving days. His lungs were weak, his joints hurt constantly. The caisson work pushed him over the edge. In 1870, with construction still years from completion, his health collapsed so completely that his doctors ordered him to leave St. Louis. He went to Europe to recuperate, sailing across the Atlantic to consult with European physicians who knew more about treating broken bodies than American doctors did. But even there, separated from his bridge by an ocean, he could not let go. He directed construction by telegram, sending instructions across the Atlantic cable, receiving reports on progress and problems. His letters were constant, demanding, precise. He wanted to know every detail. He wanted to make every decision. He could not stop. When he returned to St. Louis, he was confined to a wheelchair for extended periods. He directed operations from his home, from his carriage, from anywhere his broken body would allow him to sit and think and give orders. But he never stopped. The bridge was his obsession, his legacy, his proof that he had been right when everyone said he was wrong. He would see it completed if it killed him. It very nearly did. Above the water, the construction presented its own challenges, though none as deadly as the caisson work. Eads had designed arched spans, with the arch ribs made from tubular steel members. These tubes were innovative in themselves, manufactured to specifications that pushed the limits of what American industry could produce. Each tube had to fit precisely with its neighbors. The tolerances were measured in fractions of an inch over spans of 500 feet. The entire structure was engineered to distribute stress through the arches, transferring the weight of the bridge and everything on it down through the piers and into the bedrock below. Building the arches required cantilever construction, a technique that Eads pioneered for this project. He could not build scaffolding up from the river because that would obstruct navigation. The federal government would not allow it. So he built out from the piers, extending the arch ribs in both directions simultaneously, balancing the weight until the two halves met in the middle. Picture the scene in 1873. Two incomplete arches reaching out from their piers toward each other, not yet connected. Each half cantilevered over the river with nothing supporting it but its own structural integrity. The steel tubes extended into empty space, held up by the mathematics of stress distribution and the precision of their construction. Below them, the Mississippi continued its eternal flow, indifferent to what men were attempting above it. The workers who assembled those arch sections did so at heights of 100 feet or more, with the river churning below them and nothing between them and that water but their balance and their grip on the steel. They walked on narrow planks. They climbed on temporary scaffolding that swayed in the wind. They handled pieces of steel that weighed hundreds of pounds, maneuvering them into position by hand and windlass. Some of them fell. The records do not tell us exactly how many, but construction work at heights in the 19th century was not kind to workers who lost their balance or their grip. The connection of each arch was an event. The steel tubes had to be joined with absolute precision. Eads had designed a closing mechanism that allowed for thermal expansion, because steel expands in heat and contracts in cold. The final connections were made at night, when the temperature was stable and the metal was not shifting. Engineers watched every measurement as the two halves came together. If the alignment was wrong by even a small amount, the entire arch would carry uneven stress and could fail under load. The mathematics had to be perfect. The construction had to match the mathematics. When the last arch closed, the watching crowd cheered. Spectators had gathered along both riverbanks to witness the moment. They did not know about the men who had died below the river. They did not know about the workers crippled by the bend. They only saw the triumph above the water, the steel rib cage of the bridge finally complete, the impossible made permanent. The bridge opened to pedestrian traffic on July 4th, 1874, exactly 100 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The timing was not coincidental. The opening ceremony was designed to celebrate American achievement on the most American of days. Dignitaries crossed from Illinois to Missouri under their own power. William Tecumseh Sherman, the general whose army had burned its way across Georgia a decade earlier, delivered an address. Fireworks exploded over the river when darkness fell. Bands played. St. Louis celebrated like it had won a war. In a sense, it had. The war for commercial survival against Chicago was not over. But St. Louis had won the crucial battle. The bridge existed. The rails could cross. The railroad testing came later, under less festive conditions. 14 locomotives, the heaviest that could be assembled, crossed the bridge simultaneously, while engineers measured the deflection of the spans. This was the moment of truth. All the mathematics, all the testing, all the precision construction. Either it held or it didn't. The steel bent exactly as much as Eads had predicted it would, and not a fraction more. The math worked. The engineering was sound. The bridge passed every test the engineers could devise. The Eads Bridge entered service, and it changed everything it was designed to change. Railroads could now cross the Mississippi at St. Louis. Cargo no longer needed to transfer between ferries and trains. The commerce that had been strangling came flowing through. The manufacturers in Pittsburgh could ship to the merchants in Denver without interruption. The grain from Kansas could reach the mills in the east without changing cars. The commerce flowed, and St. Louis survived. The city did not overtake Chicago. That battle had been lost years earlier, when the railroads first bypassed St. Louis while waiting for a bridge that didn't exist. But St. Louis survived. It remained a major center of commerce and industry. The bridge saved the city from irrelevance. But here is the philosophical weight that we must carry with us as we consider this achievement. The bridge was built on death. It was built on suffering. It was built on the bodies of men whose names most people will never know. We can list some of them. Records from the construction period preserve a few names: William Saylor, John McDonald, Patrick Harney. Men who went down into those caissons and did not come back whole, or did not come back at all. Immigrants and freedmen who sold their labor for $3 a day and paid with their spines. These were not engineers. They were not designers. They were not the men whose names appear in histories of American innovation. They were laborers who sold their bodies because that was the economy available to them. They built America's infrastructure, and America largely forgot them. The Eads Bridge stands today as a testament to human ingenuity. It also stands as a testament to human expendability. The men who died building it are not commemorated on any plaque that most visitors will see. Their sacrifice is buried in historical archives, in construction records, in medical reports that Dr. Jaminet filed and that nobody reads anymore. We remember James Eads. We remember his vision, his stubbornness, his genius. We do not remember the men who carried out that vision in darkness and pressure and pain. James Eads lived another 13 years after the bridge opened. He never fully recovered his health. The man who had walked the bottom of the Mississippi in his 20s, who had built gunboats in impossible time frames in his 40s, who had bridged the unbridgeable river in his 50s, spent his final decade as an invalid. His body had given everything it had. He did other things. He designed jetties for the mouth of the Mississippi that increased the river's depth and made New Orleans a viable port for ocean-going vessels. He proposed a ship railway across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Mexico, a system of rails that would carry ships overland between the Atlantic and Pacific. Had it been built, it might have competed with the Panama Canal. He remained a visionary until the end. His mind never stopped working, even as his body failed. He died in 1887, worn out by the very achievements that had made him famous. But the bridge was his masterpiece. The bridge was the thing that proved what he had always believed, that problems labeled impossible are merely problems that have not met the right person yet. That every engineer who tells you something cannot be done is simply telling you what they cannot do. Consider what Eads accomplished. He used materials that no one had used before in major construction. He employed techniques that had never been tried at this scale or depth. He managed a workforce of thousands across multiple years. He fought contractors, suppliers, politicians, rival engineers, and his own failing health. He did all of this while men were dying on his project, while critics predicted the bridge would collapse, while his body was breaking down beneath him. And the bridge held. Go to St. Louis today. Walk across the Eads Bridge. Feel the steel beneath your feet, the same steel that those 14 locomotives tested in 1874. Look out at the river and try to imagine what it meant to sink foundations through 100 feet of sand and clay, working in pressurized chambers where the air itself could kill you. The bridge is a marvel. It is also a memorial, though we seldom think of it that way. Somewhere in the history of those piers, somewhere in the story of their construction, are the 15 men who died building them. Their labor is buried in that concrete. Their pain is part of that structure. We owe them something. Not guilt, exactly. The men who built the Eads Bridge did not build it for our guilt. They built it because they needed the work. They built it because someone had to. They built it because this is what humans do. We build things that kill us in the building, and then those things outlive us by centuries. The Eads Bridge has stood for 150 years. It will likely stand for 100 more. Long after everyone who remembers this story is dead, trains will still cross that bridge. People will still walk across it, looking down at the river, never thinking about what it cost. But now you know. Now you carry that weight with you. The weight of what progress requires. The weight of whose backs that progress rides on. The weight of the debt we owe to people whose names we will never speak. James Eads proved that the Mississippi could be bridged. He proved that steel could carry civilization. He proved that impossible was just another word for difficult. And 15 men paid for that proof with their lives. The next time you cross a bridge, any bridge, remember them. Remember that every span you trust was designed by someone who took a risk and built by people who took even greater risks. Remember that the infrastructure we take for granted was paid for in labor and too often in blood. The Eads Bridge still stands. It stands because James Eads refused to accept what the engineers told him. It stands because workers descended into the darkness beneath the Mississippi and dug until their bodies broke. It stands because steel and mathematics and human stubbornness combined to defeat the river. And now, so does their memory. As long as you remember this story, as long as you carry this weight, those 15 men are not entirely forgotten. That is the least we owe them. That is the cost of progress. That is the Eads Bridge.